Hi model rail fans and welcome back to Dean Park. In this video I'm going to take you through the complete build of this Walther's gas storage tank. In it I'll take you through kit preparation, onto priming, painting, show you some weathering techniques before finishing with full assembly. I've also got a bit in the video about how to look after your airbrush as well. If you like the video, please hit that like icon and also subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so. You might also want to hit that notification bell to be alerted of all future uploads from the channel, and if you click on the icon at the bottom right hand side of the screen, that'll take you back into the Dean Park page to show you all the previous uploads on the channel. If you have any comments, queries or questions on this video, please get in touch by posting in the comment section below. But in the meantime, enjoy the video. When I start a kit, I like to remove as many parts as I can from the sprue prior to priming, and I do that using a small sprue cutter and then just filing down any rough parts with a sanding stick. The uprights for this kit come in two styles. You've got the style that I used on the previous build in my March update, which shows the tank in the full position with the top roller quite high up the main vertical. In the left hand side one here on the kit that I'm doing, you'll notice it's slightly lower by about an inch, and that gives a representation of the tank that's not quite at capacity. I thought putting this beside the full one on the layout would give a realistic variation. The instructions suggest that you put a vertical in position and then glue one of the panels before the next vertical, the next panel, and so on and so forth until you work your way around the lower section. I did this in my first build, but when I was doing the speckled rust effect on these lower panels, I found it quite difficult to get into the corners, so in this build I've decided to prepare and paint and weather these separately before bringing them into the main structure itself. As you can see here, I've got some masking tape on the uprights, and that's to stop them getting paint on them, because those are the areas that the other panels are going to attach to, and you really want to leave a paint-free surface to get a better bond with the glue. As you can see, I've now primed all the parts of the tower, including the lattice parts at the end here. These are just held onto a wooden board with a bit of masking tape, and these were held in position with a bit of blue tack at the back. These will now be ready to be painted in the Tamiya XF19, which is sky grey. I'm now at the stage of actually having to paint it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to paint every section in Tamiya XF19, which is a sky grey colour, and I have to use the correct type of thinners, which is the Tamiya X20A. Now what I've done is I've poured two jars of this into a kind of shot glass, and I'm now going to thin it down. Now I don't want 50-50 when it comes to thinners and paint with acrylic. I'm going to go more kind of possibly 60-40 at the most, but you'll get a feel for it when you put it through the brush, whether it's too thick or it needs thinned a little bit more. The reason I've poured two jars into this test tube is if there's any difference in the paint shades between the jars, I'll be mixing it together to give a continuous colour. This doesn't really matter too much for this particular project. I don't really care if individual panels are slightly off, but it's just a habit that I've got into of putting, if I'm doing a big job, putting it all in one test tube. If you don't use it, you can always pour it back into the jar and mark it as thinned, so you know that that's the paint that's been used and thinned previously. Peeling a wee bit more there. What you really want is a kind of milky consistency, so when you put it up, it drips back in quite easily. I'm mixing more than enough paint. I can't see myself needing all this, to be honest. Give it a good stir. Okay, what I'm going to do now, apart from putting my gloves on, is I'm going to just test it through the airbrush. What I've got for this painting is around about 25 psi, no more than that. If you're doing weathered areas and more detail, you might want to turn the pressure down. So that's coming out not too bad. I feel like it's a little bit on the thick side yet. It's just not flowing quite as much as I want. So I'm going to add a little bit more thinner to that before I put it back in the cup and start the tasks. And as you can see here, I've put them all on bits of wood, just held in place with a bit of blue tack. This allows me to get a nice constant flow, and I'm not having to handle the bits in between as well. That's all the parts now painted in the XF19 Sky Grey. I'm just going to let that now dry before I take it back into the house to start sponging on some of the speckled rust, which I'll show you in the next clips. I actually went through both jars of the paint that I had, and I was actually scraping about at the end just to try and get enough to give a good coverage on all parts. There are a lot of parts in this kit, especially the lattice parts here, where there's a lot of overspray and waste, and you can see round about the parts how much paint you actually waste in the process. You may think, well, I don't really fancy airbrushing, I've not got an airbrush, how can I quickly cover these large areas? Just get yourself an aerosol. I would recommend Humbrol number 64, which is an acrylic grey. That's as close as you're going to get to the Tamiya. Why didn't I use that? Well, I've used quite a lot of that on the layout, overhead masts, fencing and that kind of thing, so I really wanted a little bit of a contrast, so I went with the Tamiya Sky Grey. Being an acrylic, it dries quite quickly. However, I'm going to give it a good hour or two just in the shed here with the heater on, just to harden before I then take it inside. I can't take it inside now anyway because it's absolutely chucking down with rain and I would ruin the painted finish. If you want to start airbrushing, it's a really good way of getting a good coverage and a good quality coverage on a larger area, or indeed when you're doing the weathering, which I'll show you later in the video, it does give you that finesse to try and get some really quite fine detail. You've got to look after your airbrush like anything else. If you look after your equipment, it will look after you. And later in the video, I'll show you how I properly clean my airbrush after a painting session. As you saw there, when I was doing the pass with the airbrush, I was going over it several times with a light pass. You don't want to just dump one big load on it, because then what will happen is the paint will puddle and run and you've ruined your surface. The same goes with aerosols. You want to maybe take a couple light passes just to get the layers that you want and move on. If you need to go back and add some more, that's fine. You just wait for it to dry and you give it another coat. After we've got the Tamiya paint dry on the surface of the panels, it's time to start adding the speckled rust effects. And this is a panel that I've just done. And the beauty about this effect is that you can add more later on, so you don't have to go too heavy to start with. You get a look that you're happy with, building up the coats as you go. And you can do as little or as much as you like. The process itself is very easy. What I've got here is an old West Hill Wagon Works kit wrapper, and I've put some browns onto that. The ones I've used, the main one is a German black brown, which is a Vallejo paint. Then I've also got burnt umber and I've got leather brown. But the main one will be the German brown. So what I do is I load up the sponge with the colour that I want. Okay, so in this case, let's start off with the darkest shade. Spread it around the surface of the sponge, and then basically take as much off as you want on the paper. Now you don't want to press too hard when you're on the model itself, because it will just smudge and it will look awful. So you're really looking to basically just dance it off the top and spring it off the top of the surface of the plastic. So when you get enough paint off and you're happy with it, there's no heavy edges of paint, I try to curve the sponge up a little bit so you get no straight edges attacking the surface. So once I've got enough paint off there, I take the piece of plastic, and it's a case of just dabbing it along the edges and the rivet panels where rust would generally appear first. If you think there's too much on, you just take a bit more off, or just press a little bit lighter on the panel. You want it in a kind of random setup here, nothing too regimented. We have more rust down the bottom where water would gather and just eat away at that painted surface. The beauty of doing this away from being part of the model is you can get into all the corners. That's something I mentioned earlier in the video. Okay, I'm happy with that shade just now. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to move to let's have some burnt umber. Again, take as much or as little off the brush as you like, and just dance it over the surface, changing the angle of the sponge as you go to get the effect that you want. Again, a bit more rustle on the bottom. There. I'm fairly happy with that. It might not look like much. I'm just going to finish by going over the surface of the curved panels there, just to take the stark grey away from the surface. I think I'll just go and actually with a little bit of leather brown as well, and just touch along the edges like so until I'm happy. And we've got some loud motorists outside as well. Then I'm fairly happy with that now. I've got some panel rust, I've got some rust along the rivet edges and along the sides and the bottom of the panel. Again, if you want to go back later on and add some more, or when you hold it up you think, actually I can do a little bit more in there, take your sponge again, let's use a bit of this, and then just literally bounce it off the surface. Until you're happy with the effect that you want. There we go. That'll not take long to dry, and I can work on the next panel. Okay, I'm now back in the shed and we're ready to give the tower and all its parts its weathered finish. From the right hand side, the colours I'm going to be using are brake dust, frame dirt, light rust and roof dirt, and these are all enamels from the Rail Match range, and I've used some HMG thinners to go with these paints. HMG actually make the paints themselves, so it kind of ties in nicely, and the thinners really work well with this particular paint. For this I've really thinned it down 50-50 between paint and thinners, or even a little bit thinner than that. With a weathering or a weathered finish, you don't want to be covering the base colour, in this case the sky grey, so by thinning it down it gives a thinner coat, and it's always easier to add more than if you add too much to start with and then you're kind of stuck with it. And that really is kind of a bit of advice when doing some weathering. Don't add too much to start with. You can always add a little bit later if you've not quite got the look you've gone for after the first coat. I'm going to use about 15 to 20 psi for the weathering of this section. It gives you a little bit more control over the amount of paint you put down, obviously along with the dual action airbrush as well. I must apologise, earlier in the video when I was doing the grey base coat, I didn't get as much footage on camera as I wanted to. The reason for that is the compressor was on the floor of the shed, which is a wooden floor, and as it was kind of sparking into life to generate some more air, it was shaking the table and all the camera footage was unusable. It looked like I'd filmed it during an earthquake. So for this I'm going to stick the compressor outside onto a concrete slab, so hopefully that will give us a little bit more stability when we're doing some of the painting. Well, that's all the parts now weathered, including the roof, which is not in the shot just now. You may have noticed when I was doing that, I was picking up this panel here. This was the effect that I went for on the first tower, and this was a spare from that, because remember it was only half a tower, so I had plenty of these panels to play around with. I tried to get the same effect on the second tower, if you like. Not exactly the same, we'd want a little bit of variation, but you know, just the kind of same build up of the rust bands and the grime on the panels. With the main section, I went for a more subtle approach using frame dirt, and then I went straight on to the roof dirt and just blended in some streaking with the rusts later on as well. What I've really got to do now is make sure I clean my airbrush so that when I come back to it next time, it's in a working condition and I've not to faff around kind of trying to remove dried paint from the inside. So I'll take you through that process just now. Okay, when you're airbrushing, I would always wear a suitable airbrushing mask. I'm not talking about the £5 ones that you get out of B&Q. This is a proper quality one designed for fine particles of paint, and it's got two changeable filters on the side there. You look kind of like an SAS guy from the 1980s when you wear it, but you know what? It's protecting your lungs. Do the airbrushing in a ventilated area, like I've got a shed here with a door open. If you can't get access to somewhere like this, I'd buy yourself an extraction fan. You can get them for £60–70 online, and it really does take the nasties out of the air and stops you breathing them in. But I would always recommend you wear a mask as well. Okay, the paint is out of the airbrush cup, and what I've just done is I've put some thinners in there, and what you do is with that is you put your finger on the end and then just pull back gently, and you kind of create a little bubble bath in there, and then that just takes the excess off the bottom of the cup and then you empty it into this jar. When you've done that, I'd get some airbrush cleaner. I use Badger airbrush cleaner, and give that a good scoosh inside. Obviously don't do this exactly in the same area as you've just painted all your models. Do it somewhere that you're not going to get it splashing on. So put a bit in there, and then again into the jar. I'm going to pull the lever back, but I'm also going to pull this needle back to allow it to clear the nozzle a little bit better, and it will drain through. Obviously the higher the pressure, the quicker it'll empty the cup. I've got it quite a low pressure just now, and I'm probably going to turn it up in a minute as well, just to flush it out a little bit cleaner. Then I dismantle. Watch, don't lose any of these parts. Now pull the needle out carefully, don't want to damage the end, and it'll always have paint on it. Alright, funny that, eh? Then what we're going to do is we're going to clean it on the paper towel. You might want to scoosh a wee bit of the airbrush cleaner on it. It'll do it right. They're not cheap to replace these parts, so if you look after it, the airbrush will last you for years. So the parts are clean. Then what I do is get the airbrush cleaner, put it through there. There's obviously the hole where the needle went, and I'm just going to scoosh some of the airbrush cleaner through that hole. And then that will rest in the bottom of the cup, and again just empty it out. Now you could take the nozzle apart here and get into the inner workings, but I do that quite regularly, but I'm not going to do it today, because I'm just going to take the airbrush cleaner again, and I'm going to scoosh in, and the cleaner will squirt out the end and just get rid of any excess, like so. Now paper towel, and then place it up here. Any hardened paint on the outer part of the cup, give it a good wipe, and inside as well. Now if you want to give it a full stripping down, there is some airbrush cleaning brushes that you can get from Tamiya. They're excellent little things, and you can get them to smaller sizes to put right the way through there, or indeed if you're taking the nozzle off, you could put it in the cup and it'll come out the front. That is really to give it a deep clean. That's what sounds like a massive pigeon's landing on the top of my shed. So there we go. That, excuse me then, I'm going to chase that pigeon away. Get lost. Thanks, sorry about that. Right, so there we go. Pretty clean now. I gave it a quick scoosh at the nozzle end as well, just to clean out any paint residue at the nozzle. A good wipe down, make sure it's all clean on the outside, and really what you've left yourself is a paintbrush or an airbrush ready to do the job the next time without having to faff around removing dried off paint from the inside. They're not cheap. If you buy a decent one, you've got to look after it. I've now started to assemble the tower. As you can see, first of all I fitted in the lower panels one by one, working my way around, and then I did the rusty panels here as well. There's quite a bit of flex in these uprights for you to manipulate and get the panels into position, and I glued these in position using some plastic magic from Deluxe Materials. Next was the platform, and this has been painted in the same sky grey colour, speckled rust just like the rest of the panels, and with a slight weathering using some frame dirt and roof dirt through the airbrush. Fitting these is a bit of a pain. The platforms are quite warped, so you've got to glue kind of each panel at a time as you go round. The platform itself comes in 3 sections to complete the 360 degrees, and the railings themselves were a bit of a pain to fit as well because they're quite warped and flexible, so you've got to kind of manipulate them. And they glue onto the side of the platforms in these kind of little indents. It's not the greatest method, but you know what, it works, I suppose. If I was doing this, or recommending if you're doing this yourself, glue 2 or 3 of the positions at a time. Don't try and glue all the fence positions at once, because you'll give yourself a bit of a job to get them all glued in the right position. The next stage really is to fit the ladder, which has been painted and weathered in the same manner, and that fits in where these tabs are. I'll do that in the next clip, and then start to fit the lattice parts onto the tower. However, before I do that, I'm going to fit the roof onto the structure, because I feel like it's easier to get the roof in position without the lattice parts getting in the way. What I'm doing now is I'm adding some weathering and rusting using Tamiya Weathering Masters set B and C, and in particular the rust, soot and orange rust from those 2 packets. And what I'm doing is I'm using the applicator sponge and I'm just getting some vertical streaking down the side of the panel lines, and later on in the clips you'll see some vertical streaking from the top corner to look like some grime and dirt streaking from the roof panel. You don't want to overdo this, it's got to be subtle, and you might even look at some of the clips and think, what have you added? But it's really got to be a subtle build up on the weathering that's already there. If you want some more dramatic, you can obviously go a bit heavier on it, and perhaps blend it in using one of the brushes as well that's on the other end of the sponge applicator. But for this particular task, I'm going for some subtle streaking to complement the rusting that I've already airbrushed onto the panels. That's both towers now on the layout. I'll be adjusting where they are a little bit, but that's in essence where they will sit. In a future video, I'll go through the entire build of this corner, from ground coverage to fencing off and landscaping on the embankment, so stay tuned for that. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it useful, and perhaps you can use some of the painting or weathering techniques on some of your own kits for your own layout. Please don't forget to hit that like icon and subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, stay safe, and cheers for now.